The divine calling. Father Peter stood at the altar, his heart filled with a profound sense of peace and reverence. He could hear the soft hum of the organ, the voices of the choir rising in harmony, and the quiet murmur of the faithful gathered before him. This was the moment he had been working for his entire life. Today, he would officially become a priest, his lifelong dream, his calling from God, now within his grasp. The church was old, its stone walls worn with the years, but still standing proudly. It had witnessed countless weddings, baptisms, and funerals, and today it would witness the beginning of Father Peter's journey in the service of the Lord. The air was thick with incense, filling the sacred space with a sense of otherworldliness. The scent of polished wood and aged stone mixed with the perfume of holiness, creating a spiritual atmosphere that seemed to transcend time itself. Father Peter's cassock felt heavy on his shoulders, but it was a weight he embraced with pride. Every fold in the fabric, every stitch, seemed to carry the prayers of those who had walked this path before him. His hands, now steady as they gripped the edges of the altar, trembled slightly with the gravity of the moment. He was on the cusp of something great, something eternal. His heart swelled with joy as he turned to face the congregation. The parishioners, a mix of old and young, sat in their pews with faces full of hope and anticipation. Many had watched Peter grow from a young altar boy to this moment of consecration. The elderly Mrs. Thompson, who had known him since he was a child, smiled warmly from the front row. She had always called him her little shepherd, and today her smile was filled with both pride and sorrow. Her husband, now passed on, had once dreamed of seeing this day. Peter had never known any other calling. From the time he was young, he had felt a deep, unexplainable connection to the church. He remembered being a boy, watching the priests with awe as they conducted Mass, feeling as if God's presence was most tangible in their hands. It was in the quiet prayers, the solemn rituals, and the unwavering devotion that he found his purpose. As a teenager, Peter had wrestled with doubts, but over time, the uncertainty faded, replaced by an unwavering sense of purpose. He knew this was his destiny. His parents, though proud, had questioned his decision. "You don't have to do this, son," his father had said, his voice thick with concern. "There are other paths you could take, other ways to serve." But Peter had always known. The life of a priest was not a life of comfort or luxury. It was a life of service, of sacrifice, and of devotion. It was a life that called for humility, for compassion, and for a profound love of God and of others. Today, Peter was about to take the final step. He would be ordained, and from this day forward, he would serve the people of his parish, guide them through their trials, and help them seek the Lord's forgiveness and grace. His hands would bless, heal, and comfort. His voice would offer solace and counsel. And yet, even as he stood there, ready to make his vows, a feeling of unease lingered in his heart, a whisper of doubt that he could not shake. It was faint, but it was there. "Dear brothers and sisters in Christ," Father Peter began, his voice resonating through the church, "we are gathered here today to witness the sacrament of ordination, as I, Peter, humbly offer my life to the service of the Lord." The words felt weighty, each syllable a declaration of his devotion. The congregation sat in rapt attention, their eyes fixed on him. Some of them had known him for years, others for only a short time, but all of them had come today to witness this sacred moment. As Peter began the liturgy, a deep calm washed over him. He spoke the words of the prayer with clarity and conviction, feeling the power of the Holy Spirit moving through him. The prayers had been practiced, the vows rehearsed countless times in his mind, but today they carried a weight unlike any other. His eyes drifted briefly over the congregation. He saw familiar faces, Mrs. Thompson's beaming smile, the quiet nod of old Mr. Harrison, who had been a member of the parish for decades. There was Julian, a local law enforcement officer, sitting with his large German shepherd, Samson, who had become a regular at Mass in recent months. Julian was a good man, dedicated to his work and his faith, And though he had always kept to himself, Peter respected him deeply. His presence today was a silent affirmation of Peter's decision, a testament to the community that had supported him on this journey. But as Peter's gaze lingered on Julian, something strange stirred within him. It was a fleeting thought, barely perceptible, but it was there. A feeling of unease. It was not a feeling of doubt about his calling, but rather a sense that something was amiss. A shadow at the corner of his vision, just beyond his reach. He quickly dismissed it. It was nothing. He was just nervous. After all, it was the culmination of years of preparation. The Mass continued, the prayers flowing with reverence and grace. Father Peter moved through the liturgy with practiced ease until it was time for the moment of ordination, the moment when he would take his vows and pledge his life to God. The bishop, a wise and kindly man named Bishop Alden, stepped forward to administer the sacrament. He placed his hands on Peter's head, and in that moment, Father Peter felt something beyond words. It was as if time stood still, and he was enveloped in a divine light. The weight of centuries of faith and devotion seemed to rest upon him, and in that instant, he knew with absolute certainty that this was the path he was meant to walk. But as the bishop spoke the words of ordination, there was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable, a change in the atmosphere, a disturbance that seemed to ripple through the church. Peter's heart skipped a beat, and he froze for just a moment. It was as if the earth beneath him had shifted, and he had lost his footing. The feeling passed quickly, but the unease remained, a gnawing sensation at the back of his mind. He turned his attention back to the Mass, determined to push it aside. But then, without warning, a sound cut through the silence. Bark. It was loud, sharp, and unmistakable. A single, frantic bark that echoed through the church. Father Peter's heart leaped into his throat. He turned toward the source of the noise, his eyes scanning the congregation. It came again, louder this time. Bark. The noise was coming from the back of the church. Father Peter's gaze landed on Julian and his dog, Samson. The dog was standing, his head raised high, ears pricked forward, staring intently at Father Peter. Samson let out another bark, this one filled with urgency. Father Peter's brow furrowed. Samson was not a dog prone to fits of barking. He was well-trained, always calm and collected. But today, there was something different in the dog's behavior. It was as if he had sensed something important, something wrong. The congregation's attention shifted to the back of the church. The murmurs grew louder as more people turned to look. Julian was trying to calm Samson, but the dog was relentless. He stood firm, barking at Father Peter, his gaze fixed on the priest as if trying to warn him of something. Father Peter's heart began to race. What was happening? Why was Samson reacting this way? Could it be some sort of sign? A test? Bark. This time, the bark was followed by a low growl. The dog's stance was rigid, unyielding, as if he were guarding something or someone. Father Peter's mind raced. Was this some sort of omen? Should he continue with the ceremony? Or was there something more urgent, something that needed to be addressed? The unseen warning. The murmur among the congregation grew louder. Eyes shifted nervously from the dog to Father Peter, whose heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. The church had always been a sanctuary of peace, but now the air was thick with tension. Samson's barking echoed through the stone walls, reverberating in a way that made it feel as if the very foundation of the church were shaking. The once serene atmosphere now felt uneasy, as though an invisible storm had settled over them. Father Peter glanced at Julian, who was doing his best to calm the dog, but Samson's attention was solely fixed on him. The priest's instincts kicked in, and he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. It was as if some presence, had entered the room. The dog wasn't just barking for attention. He was trying to communicate something. But what? "Samson, quiet down," Julian said with a strained voice, trying to pull at the dog's leash, but the dog refused to be subdued. Samson's growls became more intense, and his posture was tense, his body vibrating with agitation. Peter could see the fear in Julian's eyes, a man who had always been composed, a law enforcement officer accustomed to handling chaos. But this was different. This was something he couldn't control. "I'm sorry, Father," Julian said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. Samson has never reacted like this before. Father Peter's gaze shifted to the parishioners who were now visibly shaken. Some were clutching the backs of the pews, others were staring wide-eyed at the dog, while a few were muttering prayers under their breath. The elderly Mrs. Thompson was clutching her rosary tightly, her face pale with worry. The tension was palpable. Something was not right. But what was it? And why was it happening now, on this sacred day? "Samson, please," Julian said, his voice desperate. But the dog's gaze didn't waver. Samson was fixated on Peter, as if the priest were the only thing that mattered in the room. Father Peter took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had known the path to priesthood wouldn't be easy, but he had never anticipated this kind of disruption. His hand shook slightly as he held the chalice, the sacred vessel trembling in his grasp. A wave of doubt washed over him, one that he had never felt before. Was this some kind of test? Was this a message from God? Or was it a mere coincidence that the dog had chosen now to make his presence known? "Perhaps we should take a break," Father Peter suggested, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Let us take a moment to pray and calm our hearts. Samson, please." As he spoke, the dog suddenly stopped barking. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, heavy with anticipation. Father Peter's heart raced as he tried to make sense of the events unfolding before him. He had been on the cusp of something sacred, something that would change his life forever, but now he was surrounded by confusion and fear. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash broke the stillness. A chair at the back of the church toppled over, and a woman screamed in panic. Her voice echoed through the sacred space, piercing the heavy silence. "What in the world is going on?" An elderly man shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "That dog's possessed. Get it out of here before it does something terrible." The panic spread quickly. People began standing up, some pushing past others to exit the pews, their footsteps hurried and disorganized. The atmosphere in the church shifted from reverence to chaos in an instant. "Stay calm," Father Peter called out, raising his hands in an attempt to restore order. "This is a house of God. Please, everyone, remain calm." But the panic was contagious. One by one, people began fleeing the church, some running to the back doors, others seeking refuge behind the pillars and confessional booths. The church, which had been filled with hopeful anticipation just moments ago, was now in turmoil. The situation seemed to spiral further out of control, and Father Peter felt his resolve slipping. He was the one supposed to guide these people, to offer them peace, but right now, he was at a loss. His chest tightened as the weight of the moment bore down on him. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out from the back. "Father Peter, it's Julian. We need to talk. Samson, he's been trained for something specific, something I never thought would come to this." Father Peter turned, his eyes locking with Julian's. The law enforcement officer was now standing, his face grim, his hand shaking slightly as he held onto the leash of his dog. Samson, though still on high alert, was no longer barking. Instead, he stood rigid, his eyes never leaving Father Peter. "Samson," Peter asked, his voice low with curiosity, his mind racing with questions. "What do you mean trained for something specific?" Julian hesitated, glancing around the church as if searching for the right words. "You see, Father," he began, his voice strained, "Samson isn't just a regular dog. He's trained to detect substances, prohibited ones. But I never expected him to react this way." Father Peter furrowed his brow in confusion. "Substances? But what does that have to do with what's happening here?" "I don't know, Father," Julian replied, his voice shaking with uncertainty. "But something about you, something about this ceremony. It triggered him. Samson is reacting like this because he senses something unusual, something dangerous. Father Peter's heart skipped a beat. Dangerous? But what could it be? What is Samson trying to warn us about? Julian stepped forward cautiously, his eyes never leaving the dog. I've worked with Samson for years now, Father. He's never been wrong when he reacts like this. He's trained to detect illegal substances, but I can't shake the feeling that something is off today. I thought it was just a coincidence, but now, I'm not so sure. Father Peter stood still, his mind reeling with questions, none of which seemed to have clear answers. Was it possible that the dog could sense something hidden within him, something he had kept buried deep within his soul? Was it some kind of premonition, a warning from a higher power? The entire church had now fallen silent. The frantic energy had subsided, and all eyes were on Father Peter. The once peaceful congregation, now fractured and unsure, looked to him for guidance. He was the one who was supposed to bring them hope, but now, he was the one who needed it the most. Samson, still staring intently at Father Peter, let out another low growl, a sound that vibrated in the air like a warning bell. Father Peter's hands trembled as he clutched the altar, his mind in turmoil. Was this a test of faith, or was there something more to this strange occurrence? He had always believed in the power of divine intervention, but now, the line between the sacred and the unknown seemed impossibly blurred. Julian, Father Peter said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. I need to understand. What is Samson trying to tell us? What does he know that we don't? The law enforcement officer took a deep breath, his face pale. I wish I knew, Father, but right now, all I can tell you is that something is happening here. Something that we might not be ready to face. The revelation. The tension in the church had become suffocating, a heavy weight on everyone present. As Father Peter stood at the altar, his hands trembling, his thoughts were a whirlwind. Samson's presence, along with his strange, almost mystical behavior, left him with more questions than answers. Julian, the usually composed officer, was clearly shaken, his usual calm replaced with an urgent, almost desperate look in his eyes. Father Peter slowly took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the dog, whose gaze never wavered from him. Samson's stance was almost regal now, his large frame still and silent, but the air around him seemed charged, as though he was holding some secret, something profound that only he could sense. For a moment, the priest thought he could almost hear the dog's thoughts, a low, rumbling voice that seemed to speak directly to his soul. What's happening here? Peter murmured to himself, his words barely audible over the stillness of the room. He felt an overwhelming urge to understand the cause of this unsettling disruption, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it went far beyond a mere coincidence. Julian, looking increasingly uncomfortable, stepped forward. Father, this isn't just about a dog. Samson, he has an ability. He was trained to detect illegal substances, but I think he's reacting to something else. Something far more dangerous. Father Peter turned to face Julian, his brow furrowed in confusion. Dangerous? But what could he be sensing that's so dangerous? Julian hesitated. He was a man of facts, logic, and clear reasoning, but the events that had transpired in the church that day defied all explanation. Samson had never reacted in such a way before, and Julian had witnessed the dog's incredible abilities in action countless times. It wasn't just his training, it was something more. I don't know, Father, Julian admitted, his voice tight with uncertainty. But whatever it is, Samson is trying to warn us. He's reacting to something he senses beneath the surface. And whatever it is, it's something we can't ignore. Father Peter stood still, his mind racing. Could it be that Samson had detected something hidden within him, something he wasn't even aware of? He glanced down at his hands, the hands that had been raised in prayer for so many years. Had he, too, been hiding something, perhaps unknowingly, something that was now being brought to light in the most unsettling way? The air in the church seemed to grow colder, the silence more oppressive. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic panting of Samson, whose eyes never left Father Peter. "What if Samson is trying to tell us something?" Father Peter said aloud, his voice tinged with doubt. "What if there's something hidden here, something we've all overlooked?" Julian's face grew pale. "Father, what are you suggesting?" Father Peter shook his head, unsure of his own thoughts. "I don't know, Julian. I can't explain it. But I feel as though this isn't just about a dog reacting to a scent. It's as if something, or someone, is trying to tell us something that we're not hearing." The congregation, who had been watching in hushed silence, began to murmur among themselves again. There was fear in their eyes, fear of the unknown, of the power that Samson seemed to wield. Some of them were beginning to question whether this was some kind of divine test, a message that they were not prepared to receive. Mrs. Thompson, still clutching her rosary tightly, finally spoke, her voice quivering with fear. "Father, are you suggesting that this is some kind of sign? A warning from God?" Father Peter hesitated. Was it possible? Could this disruption, this chaotic moment, be a divine intervention? Was God speaking to him through the actions of a dog? Of all things. His mind reeled with the implications, but deep down, a part of him knew that the answer was far beyond his understanding. "I don't know, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice low. "But I do know that there is something happening here that none of us can ignore. Whatever Samson is reacting to, we must understand it." Suddenly, the church doors creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside. Father Peter's gaze shifted to the newcomer, a man who had been sitting in the back of the church earlier, but now seemed to be making his way to the front. It was Father Thomas, the retired priest who had once served in the parish many years ago. His reputation had been one of wisdom and spiritual insight, though he had long since retired due to health issues. Father Thomas was a man known for his deep understanding of Scripture and the mysteries of the divine. As he approached, the atmosphere seemed to change once again. The church, which had been filled with an undercurrent of fear and confusion, now seemed to hold its breath. The air itself seemed to shift with the arrival of Father Thomas, and even Samson seemed to sense the change. The dog's posture relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained vigilant, still focused on Father Peter. "Father Peter," Father Thomas said, his voice gravelly with age. "I heard the commotion from outside. What's happening here?" Father Peter looked at him, his face drawn and tired. "I'm not sure, Father Thomas. This dog, Samson, seems to be reacting to something. Something about me. Something about this ceremony." Father Thomas raised an eyebrow, a knowing look passing across his weathered face. "Ah, so it is you. What do you mean?" Father Peter asked, his heart skipping a beat at the words. Father Thomas lowered his voice, taking a step closer to Father Peter. "I've seen this before, my son. This dog, Samson, he's not just a regular animal. He's a sentinel, an emissary of sorts. He's been sent here to warn you." Father Peter's heart raced. "Warn me? Of what?" Father Thomas looked around at the congregation, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces. "You have been chosen, Father. Chosen for a task greater than you can imagine. But there are those who will try to stop you. There are forces at play, things that you cannot see yet, but that Samson can. This dog, he is here because he senses something that is hidden, something that you must uncover." The words hit Father Peter like a cold wave. He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, and a deep, unsettling truth was starting to form in his mind. Samson wasn't just reacting to a simple scent. He was reacting to a danger, a hidden truth, something that was tied to Father Peter himself. "What do I need to do?" Father Peter asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. Father Thomas smiled, though it was a somber smile, as if he had known this moment would come for a long time. "You must listen, Father. You must listen to what Samson is trying to tell you. He will guide you." The room seemed to fall silent once more. Father Peter felt as though he were standing at the edge of a great precipice, unsure of what lay below but knowing that he had no choice but to take the leap. And then, as if on cue, Samson barked once more, but this time it was different. The bark was sharp and clear, like a warning bell in the distance, ringing louder and louder, growing stronger and more insistent. Father Peter's heart pounded in his chest. The moment of truth had arrived, the unraveling. The church had fallen eerily silent. Father Peter's eyes locked with Samson's as the dog barked once again, its powerful sound echoing throughout the walls, reverberating off the stained glass windows. It wasn't the barking of a frightened or agitated dog. It was the bark of something purposeful, as if Samson was trying to communicate something far beyond the capacity of ordinary animals. The sharpness in his eyes, the deliberate stance of his body, and the intensity in the air seemed to tell Father Peter that he was on the verge of a revelation. But what? Father Thomas stood by, watching Father Peter with a mixture of pity and resolve. The retired priest's weathered face was now illuminated by a wisdom that seemed to come from a place much deeper than the years he had spent on earth. There was no fear in his expression, only calm certainty. "Father Peter," Father Thomas said quietly, stepping closer, "you've been chosen to see what others cannot. The truth has always been hidden in plain sight, but it takes someone brave enough to face it." Father Peter swallowed, trying to steady his breath, his heart pounding with uncertainty. "What truth, Father Thomas? What is Samson trying to tell me?" Father Thomas glanced at the dog again, and then, with a faint sigh, turned his gaze toward the congregation. Some of the parishioners had already begun to murmur among themselves, their anxiety turning to whispers, their once prayerful expressions replaced by a mixture of confusion and unease. Father Peter turned back to Samson, who had stopped barking but still stood rigid, watching him closely. The dog's unblinking stare felt almost like an accusation. Father Peter's pulse quickened as he felt a pressure building within his chest, a sense of urgency that couldn't be ignored. "It's not just about a dog, Father Peter," Father Thomas said softly, as though the words were meant only for him, even though the rest of the church could hear them. "Samson knows something. He has always known something. You see, Samson is no ordinary dog. He has been a part of something bigger, something that you've been part of too. He's here to guide you through the hardest trial of your life." Father Peter felt his blood run cold. "What are you saying? What trial?" Father Thomas' eyes seemed to darken with something ancient, something heavy that had lived within him for years. "You have been a part of this parish for a long time, Father Peter. You've stood at the pulpit, leading your flock, praying for their souls. But what if I told you there was a part of your past, buried so deep that even you have forgotten it? A part that has returned now, just when it's most needed." Father Peter's mind was racing, and he felt as though the walls of the church were closing in around him. He glanced at Samson again, who was now sitting quietly at the center of the aisle, his eyes unwavering. Father Peter swallowed hard. "What are you saying? What's in my past?" Father Thomas hesitated, his voice lowering even further. "I am not sure you are ready to hear this, but the time has come. You were once involved in something dark, something that could destroy everything you've worked for. And now Samson is here to protect you from it, or perhaps to force you to confront it." The words hit Father Peter like a shockwave. A surge of confusion mixed with horror flooded his mind. He had always considered his past to be nothing more than a faint memory long forgotten. But now, hearing Father Thomas's words, something deep inside him began to stir, a memory flickering like a dim light in the back of his mind. "What do you mean? What dark thing are you talking about?" Father Peter asked, his voice a mixture of fear and disbelief. Father Thomas hesitated, looking around the room at the nervous faces of the parishioners who were witnessing this strange, unsettling scene. "There are things we all try to bury, Father Peter. We all have our demons, our secrets. But sometimes those secrets come back to haunt us. Samson wasn't just trained to detect substances, to track down criminals. He was trained for something far more important. He was trained to protect the one who would confront the evil that lies within, evil that you have yet to remember. Father Peter's mind reeled. What could this possibly mean? He had been a priest for years, dedicated to his faith, to his parish, to his people. But the fear that had crept into his heart when Father Thomas spoke of his dark past could no longer be ignored. "Father Thomas, you're scaring me," Father Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never been involved in anything dark, nothing criminal. I've lived my life in service of God and my parishioners." Father Thomas nodded solemnly. "I believe you, Father. But you were once part of something much bigger, much more dangerous than you can imagine. It's why Samson is here. He's not just here to expose your past. He's here to show you what has been hidden from you." Father Peter took a step back, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Could there be something about him, something in his past that he had forgotten or repressed, that could change everything? The tension in the church was palpable, and now, even the parishioners who had been merely curious were becoming restless, the fear in their eyes growing as they witnessed this strange and unexpected turn of events. A woman near the back of the church gasped loudly. I knew it," she said, her voice quivering. "I always knew there was something about Father Peter, something he wasn't telling us." Father Peter turned quickly, his eyes searching the crowd. "What are you talking about? What do you mean by that?" The woman, pale and shaken, stepped forward. "It's the way you came to this town, Father. You arrived one night, almost out of nowhere. No one knew where you came from or why you were here. And there were whispers about the past you kept hidden, about things you were involved in before you became a priest." Father Peter's heart sank as the woman's words struck him like a bolt of lightning. Was it true? Had there really been a part of his life he had forgotten? Was there something buried so deep that even he couldn't recall it? Before he could say anything more, Samson barked again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the usual sharp bark. It was a low growl, a warning. Father Peter turned back to the dog, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had to know what Samson was trying to tell them. The weight of the moment was too heavy to ignore any longer. Something was coming to the surface, something that had been hidden from him for so long, and he could feel it. He could feel it clawing at the edges of his consciousness, begging to be remembered. Father Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to face it alone, Father. Samson is here to guide you. Whatever happens next, you have the power to confront it. You always have." Father Peter took a deep breath, looking at Samson, then at the congregation, and then back to Father Thomas. The pieces were starting to come together, but there was still so much left to uncover. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing for sure. The time had come to face his past, and whatever darkness was lurking there. The awakening. Father Peter's mind was spiraling. He had always thought that the past was a place to leave behind, a realm sealed with the keys of forgiveness and redemption. But now, standing in the midst of this chaotic moment, with Samson's unyielding stare boring into him, he realized that the past had never really stayed buried. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to come to light. The church, once a place of sanctuary, felt more like a prison now. The weight of the situation seemed to settle in his chest, tightening like an iron grip. Samson's deep, unsettling growl echoed throughout the building once more, causing several parishioners to flinch and look toward the door, as if trying to make a hasty exit. The dog was not attacking them. No, it wasn't that kind of threat. But his presence was an undeniable reminder that something important, was about to be revealed. Father Peter's thoughts were racing. "I don't understand," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. "What does this all mean? What is it that I need to see?" Father Thomas, standing by his side, gave a small nod. "The past is rarely as distant as we would like it to be, Peter. It's always connected to who we are now, even if we don't remember. It's the things we've done, the choices we've made, that shape us, whether we choose to remember them or not." Father Peter turned to him, a pained expression on his face. But I didn't choose this. I didn't choose to be part of anything dark. I chose to dedicate myself to the church, to live a life of service. I never wanted to be involved in anything sinister. I just wanted to help people." Father Thomas sighed, as if weighing his words carefully before speaking. "Sometimes, Peter, we're swept up in things that we don't understand. And sometimes, the things we want to forget are the very things that need to be confronted for us to move forward." The words felt like a punch to Peter's gut. Confronted with his own growing sense of confusion and fear, he glanced around the room. The parishioners, who had come to Mass expecting the routine of prayer and peace, now seemed unsettled. Whispers had begun to spread like wildfire, and the once serene atmosphere had turned into a strange, almost hostile environment. Some were clutching their rosaries tightly, while others cast uneasy glances at the dog, whose eyes remained fixed on Father Peter. It was as though Samson knew something that they didn't, and that knowledge was too much for them to bear. Peter's gaze landed on the woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had mentioned the mysterious past that followed him into this town. She was now standing near the back, her eyes wide with concern. Peter could feel her eyes on him, like an invisible force pulling him toward her. He had to know more. He began to walk toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, his heart pounding louder with every passing moment. The congregation's murmurs faded into the background as he neared the woman. She stepped aside as he reached her, her face pale but determined. "What do you know about me?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. The woman swallowed, nervously glancing at the dog, who continued to sit motionless at the front of the aisle. "I don't know much, Father. Just that. Well, you came here under strange circumstances. No one knew where you came from or how you ended up in this town. And then there was the talk, rumors about things in your past, things that didn't quite add up." Father Peter's chest tightened. He had hoped, no, he had prayed, that the rumors were just that, rumors. But now, standing here in this moment, with Samson watching him with unblinking intensity, he realized that the truth was much closer than he could ever have imagined. "What kind of things?" Peter asked, his voice barely a whisper, though his heart felt like it was beating in his throat. The woman hesitated, looking back at the congregation before speaking. "There were whispers about your time before you became a priest. People said you were involved in something bad, something with connections to the law. They said you were involved with people who were dangerous." Father Peter felt his stomach churn. He had spent years running from the past, building his life anew in the service of God. But now, everything he had worked for, everything he believed about his purpose, was slipping through his fingers like sand. "I don't remember," Father Peter said hoarsely. "I don't remember any of this. I've lived a life of service. I've dedicated myself to helping others, to healing. This can't be true." The woman stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you don't remember because you didn't want to. Maybe you buried it deep inside, hoping it would never surface. But Samson, he's not just any dog. He's connected to your past. His presence here, in this church, is no coincidence." Peter turned to look at the dog again. Samson's eyes were still locked on him, unblinking. The animal's calm demeanor was unnerving, as though he was waiting for something, patiently, like a sentinel watching over its charge. "You mean, this dog is here because of me?" Peter asked, his voice trembling. The woman nodded slowly. "Yes, Samson's owner. He's not just some ordinary man. He's someone who has been part of your past, someone you might have forgotten, but who has never forgotten you." The words hit Father Peter like a bolt of lightning. His mind reeled with the realization that his past, whatever it was, had been intricately woven into the present, and Samson was a key to unlocking it. Before Peter could ask anything more, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. Julian, the law enforcement officer, had entered the church. His tall, imposing figure seemed to fill the room with a sudden sense of authority. The murmurs of the congregation grew louder, and everyone turned toward him, their eyes filled with curiosity, fear, and confusion. Julian approached the front of the church, his eyes scanning the room before they settled on Samson. The dog stood up, his tail wagging slightly, but his eyes never left Peter. "I see you're still here, Samson," Julian said quietly, his voice a mixture of relief and solemnity. He turned to Father Peter. "I've been waiting for you to remember. It's time, Father Peter. Time to face what you've been running from." Father Peter's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Peter could hear. "You know what I'm talking about. The things you've tried to forget. The things that Samson and I have been trying to help you remember." Father Peter's mind spun. "I don't understand. I don't know what you're talking about." Julian's gaze softened, but there was an undeniable sadness in his eyes. "I'm not here to hurt you, Peter. I'm here to help you remember who you really are and what you've done." Father Peter's head swam with confusion and dread. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the truth felt like something he wasn't ready to face. "Come with me," Julian said, turning toward the exit. "It's time to face your past, Father Peter. You don't have a choice anymore." With one last look at Samson, whose eyes were still fixed on him, Father Peter followed Julian, his heart heavy with the weight of what was about to come. The unveiling. Father Peter had never felt more disoriented in his life. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the otherwise quiet church, each step heavier than the last. It was as though the weight of his own past had been placed on his shoulders, one revelation at a time. Samson's presence had triggered something deep within him, a chain reaction of memories that he had buried for years, perhaps decades. And now, with Julian leading him out of the church and toward whatever awaited him beyond, Peter's mind was on the verge of breaking open, as if the truth he had long avoided was finally too powerful to ignore. The church door creaked behind them as they exited, and the sunlight hit Peter's face like a sudden shock, bringing him back to the present moment. The cool morning air felt sharp against his skin, a contrast to the suffocating tension that had gripped him inside the building. Julian, walking steadily ahead, paused for a moment to allow Peter to catch up. "You have to understand, Father," Julian began, his voice calm but firm. "What you've been running from isn't just your past. It's the consequences of the choices you made. Choices that have followed you here, that have affected people in ways you never imagined." Peter's chest tightened. "I don't know what you mean. I've done everything I can to serve God. I've tried to be a good man, a righteous man." Julian turned, his eyes now soft, but resolute. "That's just it, Peter. You've been running under the assumption that being a priest and doing good works can erase what happened before. But that's not how it works. You can't outrun your past, no matter how many good deeds you do." Peter clenched his fists at his sides. The anger that had been slowly bubbling inside him now surged to the surface. "I haven't outrun anything. I've tried to redeem myself, to make up for whatever mistakes I made. What more do you want from me?" Julian's expression remained unwavering. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm here to make sure you see the truth, to help you understand why Samson is here, why the people in the church are reacting the way they are." Peter looked over at the dog, who had been walking alongside them, his eyes following Peter with an intensity that was both unnerving and oddly comforting. Samson was calm, as if he knew that the time was coming when all would be revealed. He had always been a part of something larger, and it seemed that Peter was about to learn exactly where he fit into the puzzle. Julian continued walking, and Peter followed, too lost in his thoughts to argue. The two of them made their way down the quiet streets of the small town, passing by the familiar sights: the bakery where Father Peter used to buy bread for the parish, the small cafe where he had shared countless cups of coffee with the local townspeople. But now, everything seemed unfamiliar, distorted, as if the world itself had changed, and he was merely a spectator, unable to understand the reality unfolding around him. When they reached the edge of town, Julian led him to a small weathered house that Peter had never noticed before. It was tucked away in a corner, hidden by overgrown trees and a long winding path. The house looked almost abandoned, though there was something strangely alive about it, something Peter couldn't quite place. "This is where it all started, Peter," Julian said, his voice low. "This is where you ran into the people who would change your life forever." Peter felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "I don't understand. What people? What are you talking about?" Julian didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the gate and gestured for Peter to follow him up the path toward the house. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and Peter could feel his heart pounding in his chest as they approached the door. As they stepped inside, Peter was immediately hit with a musty, stale smell that filled the air. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded photographs and old furniture that looked like it had been untouched for years. There were no signs of life, no indication that anyone had been here recently. It was as though the house had been frozen in time. "This is where I met him," Julian said, his voice distant. "The man who brought you into all of this." Peter looked around, confused. "What man? Who are you talking about?" Julian moved to a corner of the room, where an old desk sat, covered in dust and papers. He pulled out a box from beneath the desk and handed it to Peter. "This is the box that contains the truth, Peter. It's everything you need to understand who you really are, and what you've been running from all these years." Peter hesitated, his hand hovering over the box. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to know the things it might contain. But deep down, he knew that there was no way to escape this moment. There was no running anymore. With a deep breath, Peter opened the box. Inside, there were several old letters, photographs, and a small worn notebook. As his eyes scanned the contents, his heart dropped. The photographs were of him, Peter, only they were from a time he couldn't remember. The letters were from people he didn't recognize, and the notebook contained detailed notes about him, his whereabouts, and his actions from a time before he had become a priest. "What is all this?" Peter whispered, his voice trembling. Julian stood by, watching him with an almost sad expression. "This is your past, Peter. You were never just a priest. You were part of something else. Something dangerous. You were involved with people who dealt in illegal substances, people who used the church and its influence for their own gain." Peter stumbled back, his mind spinning. "No, that's impossible. I never." "You didn't know the extent of it," Julian interrupted gently. "But you were there. You were involved, Peter. You made decisions that put people in harm's way. And that's why Samson is here. He's the one who's been tracking the people you used to associate with. He's the one who's been keeping an eye on you all this time." Peter's world began to collapse. The life he had built, the life he had worked so hard to make right, was a lie. He wasn't the man he thought he was. And the dog, Samson, had been sent to watch him, to ensure that he could never escape the consequences of his past. Suddenly, the door behind them creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Peter turned, his heart racing, and his breath caught in his throat as he saw the face of the person who had once been his closest confidant, the person who had once shared his darkest secrets. "Peter, you have to face the truth," the figure said, their voice filled with regret. "It's time to make amends." Peter's vision blurred. The past, the present, and everything he had known were colliding in a way he could no longer deny. The only thing left to do was decide whether he would face the consequences of his actions or continue to run. And Samson, his loyal companion, was still watching, waiting for the moment when Peter would make the choice.